Increasing Resilience to Flooding in a Changing Climate, presented today by Darren Lumbroso. Darren is a technical director at HR Wallingford, a non-profit independent research and consultancy organisation which carries out work on flooding, ports, water resources management and coastal zones. So today, during his webinar, Darren will look at how the flood resilience of people and assets could be increased using case study examples of successful strategies and measures which have been employed in other countries worldwide. So as always, there will be time for a Q&A session after Darren's presentation. So do please submit these in the question box, in the chat box, in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen at any point during this webinar, and they'll be asked on your behalf in the Q&A session. So thank you all for logging in, and Darren, it's over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I hope you're going to find this presentation of interest. So we're going to go on a bit of a tour of the world. And the first slide, the first picture, you see two guys on a moped, and they're in Bangladesh, and they're part of the cyclone preparedness volunteer network, and they're going round an area, Polder in Bangladesh, warning about a forecast flooding and cyclone event. And I'll come back to those, but I'm going to start off in the USA. So what I'm going to be talking to you about today was really brought about because the US Army Corps of Engineers in the USA wanted to learn how poor and isolated communities in America could learn lessons from low-income countries as to how they could improve their resilience to specifically coastal flooding. So in the last 60 years, there's been an increased disparity between the rich and the poor in the US. And that's left a lot of poor people living in increasingly isolated situations. They're living on the fringes of urban areas. They've often got limited social networks in terms of friends, or organizations and family to call on in emergencies. So it's becoming an increasing issue there. And there's also a lot of government funds spent on disaster relief. So I think between the years 2011 and 2013, the US government spent $136 billion on disaster relief and recovery. And that equates to about $400 per year per household. So they wanted to think, well, can we learn anything from other countries? And also there is an issue with people living on the coast. So at present, it's about 3% of the US's population lives within the 1 in 100 year coastal flood area. That's the area that has a 1% chance of flooding in any one year. And we've seen recently from events like Katrina in 2005 and Sandy of the lack of resilience of those populations. And if you look at the figures, that coastal population is going to increase. More and more people are moving to the coast. And also they're often living in quite vulnerable situations. So for example, in 1970, about 9% of the people living in the coastal flood zone lived in mobile homes. So homes that aren't very resilient to storms and flooding. By 2000, that had risen to 23%. So I'm going to start off in Brunswick. So that's where that red arrow is. And Brunswick is a relatively affluent small town on the coast in Georgia. And what's of interest is that Georgia in general is quite flat. It has no protection against coastal floods and coastal storm surges, and hasn't been a coastal storm surge in Georgia since 1898. And in 1898, there was a 5-meter high storm surge that basically flooded the whole of Brunswick and was a very severe event. So where we started off, we thought, well, what would happen if that event happened today in Brunswick? And we have a model which basically looks at how people interact with a flood wave. So what you're seeing now is you're seeing a map of Brunswick, and you will see as I click through the slides how the flood event unfolds. That's the blue, so that's the water. and the dots you see represent people. And this model basically models all the people in Brunswick, and it models their reaction to a flood. And basically, it's a way of estimating the likely number of fatalities should a flood occur. On the left-hand side of the slide, you'll see the flood wave. So you've got a graph showing the time through the flood wave as I step through that's coming in. And in this particular scenario, we're assuming that 95% of the people have evacuated. So you'll see as I click through the slides that the flood wave starts coming in, and if we get there, hopefully, the color of the people starts to change. So you can just about see that when we get to the peak of the flood, you can see, if you can just about see on the screen, lots of red dots, and that's where there's been fatalities. So it's quite a concerning situation. I'll just get down to the last slide. And here we see the full inundation extent from this replication of the 1898 storm surge, so a 5-meter storm surge in Brunswick today. So what we then looked at was, well, what was this table here shows you the total population in Brunswick that is assumed to be there. So we've got 6 columns in this table. The first one is the number of people, the percentage of people who've evacuated, the number of total population, the number of people who are outside the flood zone, the population at risk, and the number of people who would die if this event took place. And you can see that I've highlighted in the fatality rate, it's about 45%, which is startlingly high. So even if 95% of people evacuate before this storm surge hit, you would still get 45% about of them dying, and that would be over 1,000 people dying. So we did this work in conjunction with the local emergency management agency, and we thought, well, maybe this is a bit of an over-exaggeration, and they said no. They said this is very likely to happen. These are the type of fatality rates that you would get. So there is a real need to try to increase resilience, certainly in coastal areas of the US, and especially amongst poorer communities. So one thing that was slightly troubling that we found in Georgia in general, there's less than 25% of the people who live at risk of coastal flooding believe that there's any chance that they're going to be flooded by a hurricane. And many people, the majority of people, don't believe their houses will be flooded, even though they're in a flood zone, and even though the flooding could be very serious. And flooding tends to have, in the US, a disproportionate effect on the poorer people. So to give you some examples, I mean, in terms of Hurricane Katrina, non-returnees to New Orleans, for example, were much likely to be young, unmarried black women who don't have a university degree. So in terms of property loss, I think it was 53% of black residents of New Orleans reported they lost everything, compared to 19% of white residents. So it tends to be poorer minorities in the communities who are worse affected, and also, as I said previously, are more isolated. So there is a need to do something to see how can we improve resilience. And the US Army Corps of Engineers were interested in what happens in other parts of the world. So before I go on to what happens in other parts of the world, I thought it was useful to define what resilience is. And as some of you will know, I think if you ask different researchers and different people, you will probably get, if you ask 10 people what resilience means, you'll probably get 10 different answers. But the US Army Corps of Engineers have a very specific definition of resilience. And that's the ability to anticipate, prepare for, and adapt to changing conditions and withstand, respond to, and recover rapidly from disruptions. So we took that definition, and I was doing some work with the University of Southampton, some social scientists there, and we looked at breaking down resilience into 3 different components, which I will show on this graph. So this graph that you're seeing now, on the y-axis, you've got increasing resilience. On the x-axis, you've got time. And the red arrow shows an external shock. So that could be anything, any type of disaster, an earthquake, a flood, an accident. And as I've said, the 3 components which I'll show you in this graph of resilience that we used, the first one is absorption. And absorption is concerned with resisting that initial impact of the shock, whether that's a flood or an earthquake. And it relies on strategies to cope with the shock. So rather than instigating a significant change to future shocks, it means that your resilience after you've had the flood, for example, will go down, you'll be less resilient, and then over time will come back up to what it was before, but it won't actually have increased. So if we go on to the next slide, you've got adaptation. So adaptation refers to being an anticipatory response to reduce risk. So that enables stakeholders, whether they're householders, communities or governments, to continue to function during and after the shock without significant structural change, and hopefully their resilience will increase, as I've shown on this graph. So if you've got adaptation, after you've had a flood, you will make some changes and you'll be more resilient to the next one. So your resilience will have increased. And finally, something that's called transformation, which results, transformation is where you get something that alters how society functions. So you get a new and fundamentally different state. So you get a significant increase in resilience. I know this might all sound a bit theoretical, but I'll try and put this into context towards the end of this talk when we've gone round the world. So maybe to come back to the real world a bit, move away from concepts and looking towards Bangladesh. So Bangladesh was a country that the US Army Corps were interested in learning from, and hopefully that will become apparent as I show you some of the statistics. So Bangladesh, this map shows you where it is, next to Pakistan and India. 80% of the land is floodplain. It's very densely populated, 160 million people. It's very poor. The per capita income is only just over $1,000 US a year. It's the 144th poorest country in the world, and it's basically dominated by a very big river delta, the Ganges-Brahmaputra river delta. So it's a poor place, and it suffers from cyclones, coastal flooding, fluvial flooding. And what's interesting about Bangladesh as we step through, so this is a graph showing the human costs of cyclones and coastal floods over the years. So on the y-axis, you've got number of fatalities, and on the x-axis, you've got the decades. So this shows the population in the decades, the 1960s and 1970s. And sorry, on the right-hand y-axis, you've got the population in millions. So the red bars show you the number of fatalities from Pacific events, Pacific coastal and cyclone events. So you will see in the early 1970s, there was a coastal flooding and cyclone event that resulted in over 500,000 people dying. Significant event in Bangladesh, you know, very significant. And at the time when the population was about, if you look at that black line, was just over about 60 million. So then if we look at the 1980s and 1990s, you'll see the population, the dotted black lines continuing to climb. In the early 90s, I think it was 1991, again, there was another significant coastal flooding and cyclone event, which again resulted in 140,000 people dying. So very severe in terms of fatalities. And then moving on to the present day, what's interesting, if you look at the present day, the last 2 decades, 2000 and this decade here, you will see that the number of fatalities is significantly less. The population's grown. The population in Bangladesh today is about 160 million. But I think it was in 2007, there was a significant cyclone. So you will see that red dot where there's almost 5,000 fatalities in about 2007. Now that cyclone that occurred in 2007, the coastal flooding and the magnitude of the cyclone was exactly the same as the one in 1971. So it was still very serious in terms of human cost and lives lost. But if you look at the same event that occurred in 1971, when there were far fewer people exposed to the flood, you got 500,000 people dying. And today that has significantly reduced. So there has been a lot of step forward. There's still a long way to go, but there's been a considerable increase in resilience of people to flooding. So why is that? What's happened? So the whole idea of this exercise was try to come up with the reasons. Why has there been this seemingly success in reducing loss of life to very serious flooding in Bangladesh, which is a poor country and very densely populated? So you probably won't be able to see this that well, but I'll go through some of these in details. The red bar shows whenever there's been a significant cyclone and flooding in Bangladesh, and the text shows you where there have been various implemented measures over the years since the 1960s. And I won't go on expound on all of these, but I will touch on some of these which are denoted in this slide here. And one of the reasons that Bangladesh has been so successful is that it's implemented what's called a portfolio of measures, so a range of measures. So structural measures where you build things, and non-structural measures such as early warning systems and improved communication that have come together to help reduce loss. So if you look at this this slide, in the left-hand corner we've got a concrete structure which is a cyclone shelter. And these first started being built in the early 1960s, and by the 1970s there's about 200 or 300 of these. So still not very many in terms of being able to accommodate the accommodation, the population. And even by the 1990s, when there were more of these structures, there were still issues with them. You saw in 1991, there were still 140,000 fatalities. So one of the reasons was that these shelters weren't being used on a day-to-day basis. Sometimes people didn't even know where they were there. There were some cultural issues. So, for example, there weren't separate rooms for women. There weren't places to put their livestock. So they tended sometimes not to use these. So one of the things that helped to make these more successful was to have multi-purpose cyclone shelters. So the government of Bangladesh with the World Bank started implementing multi-purpose cyclone shelters, and most of these are actually primary schools. So this photo here is actually of a cyclone shelter which is used on a day-to-day basis as a primary school. So most people know where it is. It's also been set out to meet the cultural needs of people. And then you'll see these guys in the white shirts who you saw at the beginning of the presentation. These are members of the cyclone preparedness program, which has been very, very successful and was implemented by the Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent in the late 1960s, and then officially formed as part or taken into the Bangladesh government in the early 70s. And by the year 2000, this program had 32,000 volunteers, and I think by 2015 that had risen to 50,000 volunteers. And these people volunteer, they don't get any monetary benefit, they do it for altruistic reasons, and their main purpose is to help spread the warning when there's likely to be a coastal flood. and also to assist with evacuations when there's likely to be a coastal flood. So they're linked up to the various radio stations. I think 143 radio stations. And then, as you see in this picture, they go around villages and they alert people using megaphones. So that's been very, very successful, and they're also pointing people in the direction of cyclone shelters. In addition, the cyclone forecasting system in Bangladesh has greatly improved since the 70s. So you'll see there's on the bottom left, there's a track of a cyclone. And so there's a much better certainty about what areas are going to be hit. And also the Bangladesh government has also produced training material. So the bottom right shows you some pictures from a training material about what people should do and how they should react if and when a coastal flood happens. So moving back to our conceptual model, you could argue that in terms of Bangladesh increasing resilience, it's reached a transformative stage. So transformation has occurred. So often this is sort of in human nature that things happen after a catalyst. So in the 1970 cyclone, that led to the initiation of the cyclone preparedness program, improving in flood warnings. The cyclone Gorky that killed 140,000 people in 1991, that led to improvements in the cyclone shelter design and its implementation. So there has been a real increase in resilience by bringing all these different measures together. So now I'm going to move on to Cuba. And one of the reasons that I think the US Army Corps of Engineers were interested in Cuba is that it's on the USA's doorstep, so it gets hit by similar hurricanes that hit the States. And again, if you look at what's happened in Cuba, this graph here shows the number of fatalities as a result of cyclones and coastal floods compared to its two nearest neighbors, which are the Dominican Republic, which is shown in green in this graph, and Haiti in blue. So you can see that in the 1960s, there's quite a lot of fatalities in all these countries from cyclones and coastal flooding. But as we move on, if you look in, this is the 1970s, you can see the red that indicates the number of fatalities that happened in Cuba has gone down significantly compared to the other two countries. We go into the 80s, it's very low for all the countries. But then again, in the last, or at the turn of last century, the 1990s, again, Cuba, the number of fatalities is much, much lower than its adjacent neighbor, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti, which is very near. So again, there's sort of questions raised as to why has this happened? Why has it remained consistently low compared to other countries? What are they doing differently? So again, Cuba is hit by a number of hurricanes. This table here shows in red when the cyclones have hit, and in the text, the measures that have been implemented. And I'll go through some of these measures in the next slide. So one of the things that happened is that Cuba was one of the first countries outside the big superpowers to have forecasting. So they have very good forecasting, but good forecasting of hurricanes and coastal flooding isn't enough. You need to communicate these. And one of the things that's interesting in Cuba, that although they had fairly accurate forecasts compared to other countries, there was still a perception amongst many members of the public that these forecasts weren't accurate. And it's quite interesting that in Spanish, and my Spanish isn't very good, but the word for meteorology is meteorologia. And that sounds quite close in Spanish to the word for lying, which is meteorologia. So they used to basically call the weather forecast sort of the forecast of lies, basically, in Cuba, even up to the 1980s. And then what happened, there was this guy here you can see in the left with the moustache. So he is a very well-known meteorologist. He's Dr. Jose Rubiera, and he's the chief meteorologist of Cuba. And having him, he earned a lot of trust and admiration because he was seen as scientifically credible, and he really helped to increase the trust in the forecast, so much so that when people were asked whether they trusted the forecasts for hurricanes in the early 2000s, it was over 90% of the people trusted them. So that's one way that the people began to trust the forecast more. They also have these annual preparedness, evacuation. There's also, I've got that picture of the school children there because disaster risk reduction and emergency management is strongly embedded in the school curriculum in Cuba, at primary school, at secondary school, but also in university education. And they have very, very well managed evacuation. So there's a whole host of other measures which I haven't got time to go into, but they've implemented, I know it's a very different political and socio-economic system to the US, but a lot of these are actually implemented not just from top-down government, but also from local and regional government, and it's been very successful. So going back to our theoretical resilience slide, it was Hurricane Flora in 1963 that led to about 1,500 deaths in Cuba, which you can see I've denoted by that red arrow. But since then, I think they've really reached this transformative state in Cuba in terms of resilience, really increasing resilience. And that's, again, through a whole portfolio of things, improving meteorological services, raising awareness, having annual drills to remind people of what to do, so that everyone from the youngest person in the street to the oldest person will know if they hear a warning that there's going to be a cyclone and there's going to be coastal flooding, what do they have to do? So the question, I suppose, is then, so what? What can be learned? And how can these things be applied in other parts of the world, given that, of course, Bangladesh and Cuba are very different to the US and indeed the UK, where I'm sitting? So one of the things I've touched upon is building trust. So it's really important that when you're giving out warning messages, they come from trusted sources. So that might be a government source, it might be your neighbour, it might be the Red Cross in some countries. So the thing is to find out which organisations are trusted in giving out messages. And it could be, as I said, community organisations, it could be faith-based organisations, churches or mosques. And it's really important to get the community representatives working with the emergency management organisation. So that's been especially successful in Bangladesh, where, as I said, you've got these 50,000 or so volunteers, and also in Cuba. Then education is important. So it's really important to know how to respond to a disaster, where to go, what to do. So mainstreaming disaster risk reduction and emergency management in schools is really important and can be really, really useful, that people know from an early age what to do. And the big one, which is always the hardest, it sounds easy, and I know lots of people say it lots of times, is communications. Have a trusted source. Don't just have one way of communicating. So Bangladesh, they have the website, they have people going around with megaphones, they have SMS, text messages, and also sometimes what's forgotten is you need different messages for different stakeholders. So for example, the emergency services, the police, the people who run the ambulances probably do need a different message than the person in the street. And understand what different stakeholders understand. So people in different organizations with different education levels will understand different things and different messages. So it's important to try to understand that. So to try to improve communication. And I'm really sort of out of time now, so I think I'll draw that to a close. So the US, I know people have a certain perception of the US, but the US Army Corps of Engineers is mainly, despite its name, civilians, and they were very interested in this and see how they can implement this under the changing climate, because they see their sea levels going up. There's places like Miami, which are now regularly flooded at high tide, and they're worried that when the big storm surge comes, that the poor people are really going to be really adversely affected, and they want to know what they can do about it. It's not just building big flood defences, it's doing other community-based things. So just to end, I have to thank the other people who worked on this with me, which were Natalie Suckle and Robert Nichols at Southampton University, and Kathleen White at the US Army Corps of Engineers. And this is a bit of self-publicity, and also, if you're listening and you want to go away and find a bit more about this, there is a paper which is free to download. So if you type in the name of this paper and my name, it will take you to Natural Hazards and Earth Science Systems. It's an open source paper. So if you're interested in this, or you think I haven't answered your questions very well, then you can go and take a look at this paper. So yeah, thank you very much for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you, Darren. That was really interesting. Half an hour has completely flown by. So if any attendees have questions that you'd like to put forward to Darren now, please feel free to put them into the chat box at the bottom. I can see a couple of you are typing, so I'll just give you some time to come through. But I have a question, Darren, actually. Through our journals that we do here at the IES, we've been talking about natural disasters and unnatural disasters, which may have been caused a little bit more by human interaction. And through that discussion has come up a paper that looked at whether female named hurricanes, are actually more deadly than male named hurricanes, and the kind of weighting behind that and the association with different names. And I just wanted to ask if you have come across any data that supports that, or any experience that you've had in discussions with that kind of topic.
I have to feign ignorance. Well, not feign, plead ignorance here. I did hear about that paper, but I must admit I haven't come across or done any analysis as to whether that's the case in somewhere like for example, Bangladesh, where the cyclones have names. So I'm not sure what the genders of the cyclones in Bangladesh. So I have to say, I'm not really sure on that one, Rihanna.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, that's absolutely fine. It sparked a little bit of interest from our side, so yeah, I just wanted to check. So Julie Hill, who is actually our Vice Chair of the IES, has just submitted a question, and she says, in the UK, there are multiple agencies involved in flood control and resilience. Do you have any reflections on that situation? And as a secondary follow-up, also, do you think there is a role specifically for the water companies in this?
I think there are multiple. Well, in terms of flood control, you've got the Environment Agency in England, Natural Resources Wales in Scotland, and Scottish Environment Protection Agency in Scotland, and the National Rivers Agency in Northern Ireland. So I think in terms of dealing with flooding in the UK, I sometimes feel we do quite a good job actually in terms of the flood control side. And resilience, because it is actually quite centralised. And I'll just compare and contrast that with some work I did in France. I worked in France for a bit, and France is quite interesting in that there's a lot of government, or there's far more government involvement in everyday life, but at the same time, it's got 32,000 communes, so they're essentially like I suppose parish and district councils who actually have quite a lot of powers. One of the powers is to look after flood defences. So in France in 2010 there was a big storm surge called Hurricane Cynthia, and that resulted in about 40 or 50 fatalities because these flood defences hadn't been well maintained by the local commune, because it's not top of their priority, they're very small, they haven't got much funding. And in fact, what came out of that was, I think, that they found out that not only were the coastal flood defences not very well maintained in France, but it was something like, if I recall, something like 30% of those flood defences, actually no one knew who they were owned by. So they were called these things called digues orphelines, orphan dikes. And so I have some reflections. Moving on to the water company bit, I think water companies really only have, well, from my perspective, have a role where it comes to surface water flooding from sewers. I think it is getting more joined up. I think we've seen that certainly if you go to the talking for the Environment Agency in England, you will see that you can get flood maps as a member of the public from all sources. So that's surface water flooding from rain, coastal flooding from the sea, fluvial flooding from rivers, and also even they will give you an idea of the likely flood extent if you're living near a reservoir. So I think from some respects it's quite well joined up, especially compared to some other countries. But there's always more you can do. There's always more you can do to join up the the emergency responders with the forecasters who sit at the agency or the Scottish Environment Protection Agency. So I'm not sure if I've quite answered the question, but
no, definitely you've sparked some conversation, definitely. But we've got another question coming in thick and fast now. A lady called Cheryl has asked, do you think there is an element of red tape within NGOs, which is essentially delaying progress towards transformation and resilience in certain areas of the world?
Oh, these are big questions. Well, I have to be careful how I answer some of these. I mean,
Sure.
I have worked in quite a lot of countries. I did some work a few years ago in 2014 in Haiti, and I think I'm right in saying that Haiti has got the largest number of non-governmental organisations of any country in the world.
Wow.
And it did strike me that there was maybe a bit of an issue with the number of NGOs involved in all types of things, not just disaster risk reduction, everything from new water supplies, improved sanitation, etc., etc., etc. So maybe I think that's what seemed to be overcome to a certain degree with the cyclone preparedness program in Bangladesh, and I don't think we quite got to the bottom of why it's been so successful. I mean, it might be that. I mean, one of the theories put forward by some people was that there've been so many.
Sorry to those listeners if you have lost audio with Darren. Just bear with us, but he might be able to join us again.
Can you hear me? So I was just saying that my experience of NGOs in Haiti, I did some work, and that's got a large number of NGOs. They're highest per capita, I think, anywhere in the world. And it did strike me that there was a level of bureaucracy there with NGOs that maybe having more central government involvement or a central organisation could be helpful, because they don't always know what each other are doing. And I was just saying that I think in Bangladesh, to a certain extent, that's been overcome by the cyclone preparedness program, where you've got this 50,000 volunteers. And one thing I didn't say, it's fairly equal between men and women. I think it's 55% men, 45% women in terms of who the volunteers are. And that, although that was started by an international UN agency, or international agency, the Red Cross and Red Crescent, it does seem to be quite successful. So I would say, yeah, you can get a level of bureaucracy with NGOs. I'm not sure what the solution is. Maybe something like the cyclone preparedness program, but then it begs the question of why has that been successful? I think the reasons we saw from what people said to us it had been successful was that there'd been great loss of life in Bangladesh, and there was this need or this altruistic feeling. People remember the floods very vividly, and they want to give something back, so that's why they volunteer. So again, maybe it doesn't quite answer the question again.
But no, that's good, and I can understand some of that. There might be a follow-up question. If there is, I can send that over to you. A completely different focus again from Marsden Thomas has asked: have you analysed the frequency of hurricanes and whether it's changed in line with essentially climate change over the last few years, decades, or centuries? Have you done that sort of analysis?
I haven't, but some of my colleagues probably have, and I think it has. But that's really about the best answer, because I haven't done it personally. But I mean, the research does seem to indicate that they have increased, and the intensity is likely to increase. But I don't really want to say much more than that, really, because I'm not an expert on it. Okay.
Well, you've kind of just answered the most recent question as well, which is asked whether you predict an increase in natural flood management techniques in the future.
Oh, I think that's slightly different. I think when they're talking about natural flood management, they're talking about things like sustainable drainage systems, land use change, reforestation, or in terms of coastal flooding, the restoration of mangroves, which has shown can significantly reduce the impact of waves. So I think there will be an increase in natural flood management techniques being put into place. I think sometimes, maybe, this is me speaking as an engineer, of course, sometimes perhaps the benefits are slightly overstated, and sometimes it's quite hard to quantify the benefits, which of course but a lot of governments want to know what are the benefits, what are the costs. So I think it's like anything. I think it's always about hybrid solutions. So I think there will be an increase in natural flood management measures, but at the same time, you also sometimes need hard defences, barriers and walls, together with good and understandable warning messages.
Okay, yeah. And so that also feeds into another question we've had from Alex Gilbert, where he's essentially asking so some governments are removing reference to climate change. However, how would these governments be encouraged to spend money to implement some of these measures?
Oh, that's a very good question. Yeah, and that's actually very pertinent to the US, because the person we were working with in the US who's on this paper, Dr. Kathleen White, she's a great advocate of trying to get the message across to central government that climate change is happening, it is a threat in the US. And of course, you may be well aware, I think it might be Florida, where I think at a state level you can't mention the word climate change. So one of the techniques she's been doing is not to talk about climate change in coastal areas, but to talk about sea level rise, because with maybe more conservative politicians and people who are in power who don't want to accept that climate change is happening, her perspective and her feeling was that they were more ready to do something with sea level rise. So I know this is not going to help the world's problems in general, but certainly in terms of coastal adaptation, they were seeing it happen. So in Miami, it's very clear, as I think I mentioned in the presentation, that the high tides are now flooding bigger areas than they ever had previously. And also things like Sandy hitting New York a few years ago, and of course Katrina, which was now 14 years ago. So one method is to, this is specifically in terms of coastal flooding, is to talk about sea level rise, because certainly in the US, her perspective was that was much more acceptable to certain very conservative politicians, and they would say, well, look, the sea level is rising, they would accept that, or some of them would accept that, we're doing something about that. Maybe that's one way, is to try to package the message differently, but it is a tough one.
Okay, interesting, really interesting. Our final question, which we can squeeze in quickly, comes from Arend, and she says, in emergency evacuation scenarios, one sometimes finds amongst poorer communities the perception that evacuations are driven by people who want to steal others' belongings. Yeah, has this come up in research amongst coastal flooding research, looking at resilience to evacuation? Have you had any experience with that?
A little bit. I mean, I think going back to Cuba, there was concern there, but one of the things that happens in Cuba is that they have a very integrated response. So they have both from a security and medical perspective. So they have an integrated medical emergency system. So that means they're preparing the shelters and food, and they're all staffed by doctors. But in parallel with that, they're very well policed. I suppose it's easier to do where you've got a command and control economy, and you can get that to happen. And there is always, I think, however much you persuade people and however much security you put in place, there's always going to be a small percentage of people who who stay behind for whatever reason don't leave, unless you forcibly remove them, which really, well, one, doesn't happen in many countries, and even if it does, is highly impracticable. You're always going to get a small percentage of people. So it's tough, really. Again, it's about trust. It's about trying to get across that you've got a system in place that's going to prevent looting. I'm not really sure what else I can say to that. I mean, in the States, certainly in Katrina's, the case of Katrina, there was a perception, I think there's maybe a popular perception that not many people evacuated, but actually, I think it's 80% of the people evacuating New Orleans, which was much higher than the authorities expected. Now, what didn't go well was the response to the people who were left there, the 20% of people who were left there. I think the success of the evacuation got lost, probably rightly so, in what happened afterwards, deaths, and the fact that so many poor people were affected. But actually, it was quite successful. So you've got to try and reassure people and have a system that puts in place some type of security. But I haven't done any specific research into this, but it is an interesting area, because sometimes I think it might be a bit overstated how much looting goes on. I think that there is some evidence that maybe in some countries, it depends on the country, of course, as to what the level of looting and civil unrest really is when or if people evacuate.
Okay, interesting. Thank you very much. That comes to the end of the questions that we have had from our attendees. But if others come through, I can always connect you with them. So yeah, thank you very much, and thank you to those attendees who did log in. Please don't forget to record this as attendance in the IES CPD tool on the IES website. If you've got any problems with that, just let us know at the project office team, and we can help you out with that. So this webinar has been recorded, and it will be added to the IES website and our YouTube channel. So do follow that. If you subscribe to it, you get notified every time a new webinar gets added, so therefore you don't miss any. Our next webinar will be on the 30th of October, and it's actually looking at the silk registration. So for those who work in the land condition sector, this may be of particular interest to you. We then have another webinar on the 29th called Greyfish, Illegal and Damaging Seafood, and the future of Scotland's seas. So you can register for both of those on the IES events page on our website. But finally, thank you very much to Darren and your time in presenting that. It was really interesting. And thank you to all those who have logged in.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.